In this video today, we're going to be talking about glazing. As you can see here, I've got this little piece, just a little spoon rest. Nice simple piece for demonstration purposes. And we're going to be talking about how to do dip glazing. Now there's also brush on glazing that you could do, but today we're going to focus on dip glazing for cone 10 glazes. So we've checked the piece, we made sure that it's fired and it's ready to receive glaze. So an important thing with dip glazing, as you cannot just use a brush to control where the glaze goes, is you cannot get glaze on the bottom. So what we're going to do is use a solution to cover the bottom called wax resist. So then when we dip this piece in the glaze, it then runs off. Now you can scrub it off, but that's a pain in the butt. So we're just going to go ahead and put wax resist on the bottom, wipe it around, and let it dry, and then it'll be ready to dip. So here we have our wax resist. Basically, it's a kind of a thick, kind of Elmer's glue consistency, kind of looks like the same color, and you just need a little bit. Now I'm going to attempt to pour some out here. Got to be careful. Oh, yep, and got too much there. So what I can do is take my finger and just put some of it back. Now, a little bit of this is really all you need. You really just need to coat the surface of the piece. So I just go ahead and take my finger here and rub it around. And remember, all you're doing is sealing the bottom. It doesn't have to coat it. It's not like we're painting it. The only goal of this is to keep glaze from sticking. So we're basically waterproofing the bottom so that it doesn't soak in. Be very careful with this stuff once you have it on your finger. If you touch any other part of the piece, it's really hard to get this off. You really have to burn it off. So be very careful. And notice here I'm going a little bit around the edge, maybe 1/8 of an inch up around the bottom, because cone 10 glaze has a tendency to run a little bit. So we don't want it to run on the shelf, make a puddle, and then make a nice jagged piece. That wouldn't be good. So I'm just going to make sure the total area is covered and I don't have any spots missing. And then I'm going to let it dry. So while it's drying over here, I'm going to go ahead and get the tools that I need to do the dip glazing. So over here on the wall, hanging up, we have tongs. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a pair of these tongs, and then I'm also going to grab a whisk. Same kind of whisk you use for cooking. Now these two tools are very important for dipping, so I'm going to go ahead and set my tongs down in front of the glaze that I want to use. Here we're going to be using a Zork's Red. And note when I open this, two things. One, it's very watery, so we're going to have to stir it up. But two, even though it's Zork's Red, it doesn't look red. Now keep in mind, cone 10 glazes are not always the color they look. Sometimes they change color. Actually, most of them change color. So don't worry if it's not the color it looks like. So I'm just going to take some time with the whisk. As you can see that the water was on top. The chemicals in glaze are quite heavy. They have very earthy materials in them like feldspars, spodiums, silicas, and very dense material. So that tends to sink over time. So as soon as you open the bucket, you're going to want to stir it. You're going to want to stir it pretty good. Make sure there's no chunks at the bottom. Just really try to get a nice even consistency. See me here scraping off some of the excess glaze on the edge that dries out. It's always good to make sure our buckets of glaze go as far as possible. Switch directions here a few times. Just make sure I'm getting a nice even consistency. We don't want just water. You'll find out if you get too much water in your piece because some of it will be covered in glaze and some of it will not. So just make sure you get it there. I'm doing a real good job. Just getting it all mixed up. And you can take your whisk, and the first thing you should do before you forget, because a lot of people forget and leave it dirty back there, which is a good way to lose some points, is to go over to the sink and just put the whisk in this wash bucket. Now notice I don't need any running water. I just need to slosh it around in there a couple times, and it rinses off pretty clean. Then I can go ahead and hang it back up where it belongs, up on the hook. Now I return to the glazing station where I'm working. My glaze is now stirred up. Hopefully there's no bubbles in it. See, I flick the container a little bit, make sure there's no bubbles. Now I'm going to take my tongs. Now the idea is the tongs are used to grip the piece. And we want to touch as little of the piece as possible so we don't have a whole lot of glaze we have to touch up. So if you look at the tips, you have two different tongs that go in two different directions. Now these little points make the smallest surface area possible on the piece. The goal of this is that when you're done, if it leaves little spots where glaze is missing, you can just touch them up with your finger rather than needing a brush. So get a nice firm grip on the piece. Don't squeeze it too hard. With larger pieces, you might have to squeeze a little bit harder. And some pieces may be too heavy, but you can ask me about that. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to take our piece and we're just going to submerge it in the glaze. Not jam it in there, because then it'll splash on you and make a mess and you'll have to clean it up. But stick it in there rather quickly, and you're just going to hold it under the surface for a couple seconds. Pull it out, and you're going to let the glaze run off. Now this is important. You don't want drips all over your piece. They'll melt into the glaze when it's fired, but for the most part you don't want huge thick chunks on your piece. So see how I'm tumbling it around? I'm kind of holding it at different angles. Maybe shake it a little bit and get those drips to come off. And the clay will soak in the glaze very quickly. As you can see on the right side of the piece right there, already dry to the touch. So as soon as it's dry enough where you can touch it, avoid the wet spots, you can go ahead and just grab it with your hand and take the tongs off of it. Now if I flip over, you can barely even see it. Really didn't even leave marks this time, but if there is a little mark, you can take your finger and just dip it in the glaze and just cover those two little spots if need be. Now I don't need to worry about this on the bottom because I had wax resist. Now we take our tongs over to the sink, same bucket, slosh them around, make sure no glaze is stuck on there, and then we're going to go ahead and hang it back up right where we found it. Really important to keep the glazing area clean, and one of those things is making sure the tools are always clean and put back in the correct spot. Now we're going to come back and always make sure you put the lid back on the glaze, because there's a lot of water in there and it does tend to evaporate, especially since we live in this nice dry climate. And we always want to make sure the lid is on and sealed shut. If it dries out a little bit, we can add some water, but you should always check the consistency of the glaze before dipping, because if it's too thick, you'll get cracks, bubbles, and then it'll run and you'll have a messy piece. And also make sure to put the cap back on the wax resist, put it back in the middle of the table, and make sure that you now wipe off any excess glaze. Now the wax resist kept the glaze from sticking, but there still are some drops of glaze on there, and we want to get that off. Now some people ask me, do we have to worry about wax resist? No. It burns off and disintegrates in the kiln. So wax resist is not a problem. You can leave it on there. It's not going to hurt anything. But we do want to make sure we get as much of that glaze off as possible so we don't have any chance of our piece sticking to the shelf. Make sure you always wash out your sponges as well. Wring them out. Wring them out. Not just squeeze them. Make sure clean water's coming out of there. Give it a good wring. And as soon as it's clean, put it back in the basket where you found it. Now, our piece is pretty much done, so I'll usually have a shelf out for you, and you can set it on the shelf, and then it'll go in the kiln, and it'll be fired. And that's it.